Let's talk about the state of politics at the moment, should we? Anneliese Dodds from the Labour Party joins us now. Very good to see you this morning. What are we to make? The Prime Minister's sort of, which I think is an extraordinary admission, saying that at the next general election, as it currently looks, it'd be a hung parliament with Labour the largest party. I can't quite believe that's come out of the mouth of a Conservative Prime Minister before an election. However, what do you make of the idea of a hung parliament? Because, I mean, it's not good for him. It's actually not very good for you either.
Good morning. And you're absolutely right. This is an extraordinary thing for Rishi Sunak to be saying. Actually, the very clear message from last week was that people desperately want the chance to turn the page on the last 14 years. They desperately want a general election. And rather than acknowledging that and actually setting a date, Rishi Sunak is pontificating about what he expects may happen. Well, actually, he's even got that wrong, because local elections are not a good predictor of general elections if you just look at the overall vote share, which is what he seems to have done. For example, very small parties tend to do far better in local elections. Independents tend to do better. And if you look at the places where Labour won, where Labour picked up support, it was in those constituencies that Labour will need in order to deliver a majority Labour government. So I'm afraid Rishi Sunak has got this wrong. He's tin-eared. He should be listening to that message to actually give people the chance for change.
But if the time comes, we are facing a hung parliament, would you be planning alliances with the SNP or the Lib Dems?
No, absolutely not. Quite the opposite. We're aiming to ensure that we have a majority Labour government, not in coalition with any party. We believe we have a plan and a programme that would deliver that change that people desperately need, that would get Britain building again, get our NHS back on its feet, get criminals off our streets and police onto them. Labour set out those plans. And as I mentioned, last Thursday we saw that actually Labour is winning in those areas that we would need to be winning in so that we can have a majority Labour government.
Seems to be clear in all of this. And look, I mean, it's been a great weekend for the Labour Party. That's undeniable. However, you can look at it and say, well, perhaps you didn't do as well or quite as well as you were hoping for.
Well, of course, there's no room for complacency. Labour still needs to work hard. We still need to make sure we're having that dialogue with people up and down the country. But I have to say, I'm really proud of our Labour candidates, whether that was candidates to be councillors or to be our new Metro mayors, or indeed our new Labour MP in Blackpool South, Chris Webb, because they gave people that hope that things can change. And of course, many of our Labour councillors and Metro mayors are already delivering that change in their communities, even in the face of a Conservative government that's holding our country back.
You must have been concerned, though, by the results in Oldham, where you lost control of the council there. There's a strong Muslim vote there. It's thought they were protesting Labour's stance on Gaza. That's a warning shot to the Labour Party, isn't it, ahead of a general election?
Well, of course, in any area where people have supported Labour before and Labour's lost that support, we need to understand why. We need to build back that trust, and we will be, of course, seeking to do that. It's very important for us as a party that actually Labour can seek to represent every different community, from Land's End to John O'Groats, that we are ultimately the party that wants to be in a position to deliver change for everyone. So that work is ongoing.
You want to work for everybody. How are you going to address some of the key issues? Because I don't know what you can do in any sort of rapid form to deal with the NHS and waiting lists. I mean, that would almost be a second-term job, wouldn't it? So what you're going to do about immigration, you can't turn the cost of living situation round quickly either. I mean, you're potentially in the situation of saying we're going to change everything, but by the end of your first term, actually nothing much has changed.
Well, of course, it will take time to deliver change. We've been very upfront about that. But just to take one of the areas that you mentioned, the NHS, we believe that actually tax dodgers have far less need for the money that they're saving through tax dodging than our NHS has need for that money. And we would be making sure we crack down there and putting that money into far more NHS appointments. Now, this is a bit of an emergency measure, given that we've got such a huge NHS waiting list at the moment. almost 8 million on that NHS waiting list. We would be delivering additional overtime and weekend appointments through that, 2 million more a year. Now, that's a measure that is focused on the short term, on getting that waiting list down. But of course, in the longer term, we need to make sure we've got the staff in the NHS that it requires, that we've not had over the last 14 years. We need to make sure we have a focus on prevention rather than just on cure. Again, Labour set out plans around that, plans on NHS dentistry. For example, the biggest reason why kids are turning up in A&E is because of dentistry problems. An absolute scandal. Labour would get a grip on that. So we have set out those plans. Yes, for the long term. We know we can't change things overnight, but we can do things where there's a real emergency situation, and Labour would be getting a grip on it, not just ignoring it as the Conservative government's doing.
Can I just ask you, and I know you probably thought this had died down a little bit now post the mayoral elections, but as soon as you appeared on with our new chat forum thing, it's gone mad with people saying, ask her about Wes Streeting. And I do wonder if, and you're not going to take the whip off him, I sort of acknowledge that isn't going to happen at this stage, especially for a party that wants to be in government. But saying anyone who voted for the Conservative Party in the London mayoral elections was effectively saying they were an Islamophobe or white supremacist. He needs to apologise for that, doesn't he? There needs to be some sort of sanction for that. It wasn't an appropriate thing to say, was it?
Well, I don't believe Wes did say that at all. He wasn't talking about the electorate at all. Passions do run high during elections, of course, but I think it's really clear, and the election result indicates this, that in London you had a Conservative candidate, Susan Hall, whose values were well out of step with those of Londoners. You know, she was extremely critical of the capital, one of the best cities on earth, and she continuously criticised it, continuously talked it down. She was continuously, unfortunately, making slurs about the Labour candidate that were completely inappropriate, that everyone, whatever their background, was appalled by. So I think ultimately that reflection of people's concern about Susan Hall was then delivered in that election result. And really the big question I would say here is why Rishi Sunak allowed a situation where there was a candidate who was so manifestly out of step with London's values to actually stand to represent the Conservative Party last week in that amazing city that is London. I think that's the big question here.
All right, and I'm making no comment about what you said Susan Hall said in terms of slurs, because, frankly, I haven't seen them. So I'm not commenting on those at all. But what I would say is you don't beat a slur by using a slur, do you? Which, I mean, that it was an extraordinary tweet. Shouldn't the Labour Party, if you want to be the party of government by the end of this year, shouldn't you be taking the higher ground?
Well, of course, and that's why Labour does have high standards around these issues. But as I said before, it was very clear with this election that the Conservatives had a candidate who was on the record as stating many completely unacceptable things, and Londoners rejected that very, very clearly. And I'm very pleased that they did, because I don't believe she would have been the kind of strong leader that London needs at the moment.
OK, Anneliese Dodds, Chair of the Labour Party, thank you very much indeed.